Hey kiddo, you ready for bed? Don't forget to brush your teeth, and don't forget to get some water, okay? I'm gonna start stories. Once we start, we're not gonna stop, so make sure you get some water, get comfy right now, okay? Alright, our first one's gonna be The Traveling Companion. You ready? Poor John was very sad, for his father was so ill he had no hope of his recovery. John sat alone with the sick man in the little room, and the lamp had nearly burnt out, for it was late in the night. "You've been a good son, John," said the sick father, "and God will help you on in the world." He looked at him as he spoke, with mild, earnest eyes, drew a deep sigh, and died. Yet it appeared as if he still slept. John wept bitterly. He had no one in the wide world now, neither father, mother, brother, nor sister. Poor John! He knelt down by the bed, kissed his dead father's hand, and wept many, many bitter tears. But at last his eyes closed, and he fell asleep with his head resting against the hard bedpost. Then he dreamed a strange dream. He thought he saw the sun shining upon him, and his father alive and well, and even heard him laughing, as he used to do when he was very happy. A beautiful girl, with a golden crown on her head and long, shining hair, gave him her hand, and his father said, "See what a bride you have won. She is the loveliest maiden on the whole earth." Then he awoke, and all the beautiful things vanished before his eyes. His father lay dead on the bed, and he was all alone. Poor John. During the following week, the dead man was buried. The son walked behind the coffin, which contained his father, whom he so dearly loved, and would never again behold. He heard the earth fall on the coffin lid, and watched it till only a corner remained in sight, and at last that also disappeared. He felt as if his heart would break with its weight of sorrow, till those who stood around the grave sang a psalm, and the sweet, holy tones brought tears into his eyes, which relieved him. The sun shone brightly down on the green trees as if it would say, "You must not be so sorrowful, John. Do you see the beautiful blue sky above you? Your father is up here, and he prays to the loving Father of all that you may do well in the future." "I will always be good," said John, "and then I shall go to be with my father in heaven. What joy it will be when we see each other again! How much I shall have to relate to him, and how many things he will be able to explain to me of the delights of heaven, and teach me as he once did on earth. Oh, what joy it will be!" He pictured it all so plainly to himself that he smiled, even while the tears ran down his cheeks. The little birds in the chestnut trees twittered, "Tweet, tweet." They were so happy, although they had seen the funeral, but they seemed as if they knew that the dead man was now in heaven, and that he had wings much larger and more beautiful than their own. And he was happy now, because he had been good here on earth, and they were glad of it. Jaws saw them fly away out of the green trees into the wide world, and he longed to fly with them. But first he cut out a large wooden cross to place on his father's grave. And when he brought it there in the evening, he found the grave decked out with gravel and flowers. Strangers had done this, they who had known the good old father who was now dead and who had loved him very much. Early the next morning, John packed up his little bundle of clothes and placed all his money, which consisted of $50 and a few shillings, in his girdle. With this, he determined to try his fortune in the world. But first he went into the churchyard and, by his father's grave, offered up a prayer and said, "Farewell." As he passed through the fields, all the flowers looked fresh and beautiful in the warm sunshine, and nodded in the wind as if they wished to say, Welcome to the green wood, where all is fresh and bright. Then John turned to have one more look at the old church, in which he had been christened in his infancy and where his father had taken him every Sunday to hear the service and join in singing the psalms. As he looked at the old tower, he espied the ringer standing at one of the narrow openings, with his little pointed red cap on his head, and shading his eyes from the sun with his bent arm. John nodded farewell to him, and the little ringer waved his red cap, laid his hand on his heart, and kissed his hand to him to a great many times, to show that he felt kindly towards him and wished him a prosperous journey. John continued his journey and thought of all the wonderful things he should see in the large, beautiful world, till he found himself farther away from home than he ever had been before. He did not even know the names of the places he passed through, and could scarcely understand the language of the people he met, for he was far away, in a strange land. The first night he slept on a haystack out in the fields, for there was no other bed for him. But it seemed to him so nice and comfortable that even a king need not wish for a better bed. The field, the brook, the haystack, with the blue sky above, formed a beautiful sleeping room. The green grass, with the little red and white flowers, was the carpet. The elder bushes and the hedges of wild roses looked like garlands on the wall, and for a bath he could have the clear, fresh water of the brook, while the rushes bowed their heads to him to wish him good morning and good evening. The moon, like a large lamp, hung high up on the blue ceiling, and he had no fear of its setting fire to his curtains. John slept here quite safely all night, and when he awoke, the sun was up, and all the little birds were singing round him, "Good morning, good morning. Are you not up yet?" It was Sunday, and the bells were ringing for church. As the people went in, John followed them. He heard God's word, joined in the singing of psalms, and listened to the preacher. It seemed to him just as if he were in his own church, where he had been christened and had sung the psalms with his father. Out in the churchyard were several graves, and on some of them the grass had grown very high. John thought of his father's grave, which he knew at last would look like these, as he was not there to weed and attend to it. Then he set to work. He pulled up the high grass, raised the wooden crosses which had fallen down, and replaced the wreaths which had been blown away from their places by the wind, thinking all the time, perhaps someone is doing the same for my father's grave, as I am not there to do it. Outside the church door stood an old beggar, leaning on his crutch. John gave him his silver shillings. Then he continued his journey, feeling lighter and happier than ever. Towards evening, the weather became very stormy, and he hastened on as quickly as he could to get shelter, but it was quite dark by the time he reached a lonely little church which stood on a hill. "I will go in there," he said, "and sit down in a corner, for I am quite tired and want rest." So he went in and seated himself. Then he folded his hands and offered up his evening prayer, and was soon fast asleep, dreaming, while the thunder rolled and the lightning flashed without. When he awoke, it was still night, but the storm had ceased, and the moon shone in upon him through the windows. Then he saw an open coffin standing in the center of the church, which contained a dead man waiting for burial. John was not at all timid. He had a good conscience, and he knew also that the dead can never injure anyone. It is living wicked men who do harm to others. Two such wicked persons stood now by the dead man, who had been brought to the church to be buried. Their evil intentions were to throw the poor dead body outside the church door and not leave him to rest in the coffin. "Why do you do this?" asked John, when he saw what they were going to do. "It is very wicked. Leave him to rest in peace, in Christ's name." "Nonsense," replied the two dreadful men. "He's cheated us. He owed us money, which he could not pay, and now he is dead. We shall not get a penny. So we mean to have our revenge, and let him lie like a dog outside the church." John said, I have only $50. It's all I possess in the world, but I will give it to you if you will promise me faithfully to leave the dead man in peace. I shall be able to get on without the money. I have strong and healthy limbs, and God will always help me. Why, of course, said the horrid men. If you will pay his debts, we will both promise not to touch him. You may depend on that. And then they took the money he offered them, laughed at him for his good nature, and went on their way. John laid the dead body back in the coffin, folded the hands, and took leave of it, and went away contentedly through the great forest. All around him he could see the prettiest little elves dancing in the moonlight, which shone through the trees. They were not disturbed by his appearance, for they knew he was good and harmless among men. They are wicked people who can never obtain a glimpse of fairies. Some of them were not taller than the breadth of a finger, and they wore golden combs in their long, yellow hair. They were rocking themselves together on the large dewdrops with which leaves and the high grass were sprinkled. Sometimes the dewdrops would roll away, and then they fell down between the stems of the long grass, and caused a great deal of laughing and noise among the other little people. It was quite charming to watch them play. Then they sang songs, and John remembered that he had learned those pretty songs when he was a little boy. Large, speckled spiders with silver crowns on their head were employed to spin suspension bridges and palaces from one hedge to another, and when the tiny drops fell upon them, they glittered in the moonlight like shining glass. This continued until sunrise. Then the little elves crept into the flower buds, and the wind seized the bridges and palaces and fluttered them in the air like cobwebs. As John left the wood, a strong man's voice called after him, "Hello, comrade. Where are you traveling?" "Into the wide world," he replied. "I am only a poor lad. I have neither father nor mother, but God will help me." "I'm also going into the wide world," replied the stranger. "Shall we keep each other company?" "With all my heart," John said, and so they went on together. Soon they began to like each other very much, for they were both very good, but John found out that the stranger was much more clever than himself. He had traveled all over the world and could describe almost everything. The sun was high in the heavens when they found themselves seated under a large tree to eat their breakfast, and at the same moment an old woman came towards them. She was very old and almost bent double. She leaned upon a stick and carried on her back a bundle of firewood, which she had collected in the forest. Her apron was tied round it, and John saw 3 great stems of fern and some willow twigs peeking out. Just as she came close upon them, her foot slipped and she fell to the ground screaming loudly. The poor old woman had broken her leg. John proposed directly that they should carry the old woman home, but the stranger opened his knapsack and took out a box, in which he said he had a salve that would quickly make her leg well and strong again, so that she could walk home herself. And all that he asked in return was the 3 fig stems and she carried in her apron. "That is rather too high a price," said the old woman, nodding her head quite strangely. She did not seem at all inclined to part with the fern stems. However, it was not very agreeable to lie there with a broken leg, so she gave them to him, and such was the power of the ointment that no sooner had he rubbed her leg with it, the old woman rose up and walked even better than she had before. This wonderful ointment could not have been bought at a chemist. "What did you want with those 3 fern rods?" asked John. "Oh, they will make capital brooms," said the stranger, "and I like them because I have strange whims sometimes." Then they walked on together for a long distance. "How dark the sky is becoming," said John, "and look at those thick, heavy clouds." "Those are not clouds," replied his fellow traveler. "They're mountains, large, lofty mountains, on the tops of which we should be above the clouds in the pure, free air. Believe me, it is delightful to ascend so high. Tomorrow we should be there." But the mountains were not so near as they appeared. They had to travel a whole day before they reached them, and pass through black forests and piles of rock as large as a town. The journey had been so fatiguing that John and his fellow travelers stopped to rest at a roadside inn so they might gain strength for their journey on the morrow. In the large public room of the inn, a great many persons were assembled to see a comedy performed by dolls. The showman had just erected his little theater, and the people were sitting round the room to witness the performance. Right in front, in the very best place, sat a stout butcher with a great bulldog by his side, who seemed very much inclined to bite. He sat staring with all his eyes, and so indeed did everyone else in the room, and then the play began. It was a pretty piece, with a king and a queen who sat on a beautiful throne, and had gold crowns on their head. The trains to their dresses were very long, according to the fashion, while the prettiest of wooden dolls, with glass eyes and large mustaches, stood at the doors and opened and shut them, that the fresh air might come into the room. It was a very pleasant play, not at all mournful, but just as the queen stood up and walked across the stage, the great bulldog, who should have been held back by his master, made a spring forward, and caught the queen in the teeth by the slender wrist so that it snapped in two. This was a dreadful disaster. The poor man who was exhibiting the dolls was much annoyed and quite sad about his queen. She was the prettiest doll he had, and the bulldog had broken her head and shoulders off. But after all the people were gone away, the stranger who came with John said that he could set her to rights, and then he brought out his box and rubbed the doll with some of that salve with which he had cured the old woman when she broke her leg. As soon as this was done, the doll's back became quite right again. Her head and shoulders were fixed on, and she could even move her limbs herself. There was now no occasion to pull the wires, for the doll acted just like a living creature, except that she could not speak. The man to whom she belonged was quite delighted at having a doll who could dance by herself, without being pulled by wires. None of the other dolls could do this. During the night, when all the people of the inn were gone to bed, someone was heard to sigh so deeply and painfully, and the sighing continued for so long a time, that everyone got up to see what could be the matter. The showman went at once to his little theater and found that it proceeded from the dolls, who lay on the floor sighing piteously and staring with their glass eyes. They all wanted to be rubbed with the ointment so that, like the queen, they might be able to move of themselves. The queen threw herself on her knees, took off her beautiful crown, and holding it in her hand cried, "Take this from me. Do rub my husband and his courtiers." The poor man who owned the theater could scarcely refrain from weeping. He was so sorry that he could not help them, that he immediately spoke to John's comrade, and promised him all the money he might receive at the next evening's performance, if he would only rub the ointment on 4 or 5 of his dolls. But the following traveler said that he did not require anything in return, excepting the sword which the showman wore by his side. As soon as he received the sword, he anointed 6 of the dolls with the ointment, and they were able to immediately dance so gracefully that all the living girls in the room could not help joining in the dance. The coachman danced with the cook, and the waiters with the chambermaids, and all the strangers joined. Even the tongs and the fire shovel made an attempt, but they fell down after the first jump. So after it was a very merry night, the next morning John and his companion left the inn to continue their journey through the great pine forest and over the high mountains. They arrived at last at such a great length that towns and villages lay beneath them, and the church steeples looked like little specks between the green trees. They could see for miles around, far away to places they had never visited, and John saw more of the beautiful world than he had ever known before. The sun shone brightly in the blue firmament above, and through the clear mountain air came the sound of the huntsman's horn, and the soft, sweet notes brought tears into his eyes, and he could not help but exclaim, "How good and loving God is to give us all this beauty and loveliness in the world in order to make us happy." His fellow traveler stood by with folded hands, gazing on the dark wood and the towns bathed in warm sunshine. At this moment there sounded over their heads sweet music. This caused them to look up, and discovered a huge white swan hovering in the air, singing as never birds sang before. But the song soon became weaker and weaker before the bird's head drooped and he sunk slowly down and lay dead at their feet. "It is a beautiful bird," said the traveler, "and these large white wings are worth a great deal of money. I will take them with me. You see now that a sword will be very useful." So he cut off the wings and carried them away. They now continued their journey over the mountains for many miles, till they at length reached a large city containing hundreds of towers that shone in the sunshine like silver. In the midst of the city stood a splendid marble palace, roofed with pure gold, in which dwelt the king. John and his companion would not go down immediately, so they stopped at an inn outside the town to change their clothes, for they wished to appear respectable as they walked through the streets. The landlord told them that the king was a very good man, who never injured anyone, but as to his daughter, heaven defend us. She was indeed a wicked princess. She possessed beauty enough. Nobody could be more elegant or prettier than she was, but what of that? For she was a wicked witch, and in consequence of her conduct, many noble young princes had lost their lives. Anyone was at liberty to make her an offer. Were he a prince or a beggar, it mattered not. She would ask him to guess 3 things which she had just thought of, and if he succeeded, he was to marry her, and be king over all the land when her father died. But if he could not guess these 3 things, then she ordered him to be hanged or to have his head cut off. The old king, her father, was very much grieved at her conduct, but he could not prevent her from being so wicked, because he once said he would have nothing more to do with her lovers. She might do as she pleased. Each prince who came and tried the 3 guesses so that he might marry the princess had been unable to find them out, and had been hanged or beheaded. They had all been warned in time, and might have left her alone if they would. The old king became at last so distressed at all these dreadful circumstances that for a whole day every year he and his soldiers knelt and prayed that the princess might become good. But she continued as wicked as ever. The old woman who drank brandy would color it quite black before they drank it, to show how they mourned, and what more could they do? "What a horrible princess," said John. "She ought to be well flogged if I were the old king. I would have punished her in some way." Just then they heard the people outside shouting, "Hurrah!" and looking out, they saw the princess passing by, and she was really so beautiful that everyone forgot her wickedness, and shouted, "Hurrah!" 12 lovely maidens in white silk dresses, holding golden tulips in their hand, rode by her side on coal-black horses. The princess herself had a snow-white steed, decked with diamonds and rubies. Her dress was of cloth of gold, and the whip she held in her hands looked like a sunbeam. The golden crown on her head glittered like the stars of heaven, and her mantle was formed of thousands of butterfly wings, sewn together. Yet she herself was more beautiful than all. When John saw her, his face became as red as a drop of blood, and he could scarcely utter a word. The princess looked exactly like the beautiful lady with the golden crown, whom he dreamt about on the night his father died. She appeared to him so lovely that he could not help loving her. It could not be true, he thought, that she was really a wicked witch who ordered people to be hanged or beheaded. If they could not guess her thoughts, everyone has permission to ask her hand, even the poorest beggar. "I shall pay a visit to the palace," he said. "I must go, for I cannot help myself." Then they all advised him not to attempt it, for he would be sure to share the same fate as the rest. His fellow traveler also tried to persuade him against it, but John seemed quite sure of his success. He brushed his shoes and his coat, and washed his face and his hands, combed his soft flaxen hair, and then went out alone into the town and walked to the palace. "Come in," said the king, as John knocked at the door. John opened it, and the old king, in a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, came toward him. He had the crown on his head, carried his scepter in one hand, and the orb in the other. "Wait a moment," said the king, and he placed the orb under his arm so that he could offer the other hand to John. But when he found that John was another suitor, he began to weep so violently that both the scepter and the orb fell to the floor, and he was obliged to wipe his eyes with his dressing gown. "Poor old king. Please leave her alone," the king said. "You will fare as badly as all the others. Come, I will show you." Then he led him out into the princess's pleasure gardens, and there he saw a frightful sight. On every tree hung 3 or 4 kings' sons who had wooed the princess, but had not been able to guess the riddles she gave them. Their skeletons rattled in every breeze, so that the terrified birds never dared to venture into the garden. All the flowers were supported by human bones instead of sticks, and human skulls in flower pots grinned horribly. It was a doleful garden for a princess. "Do you see all this?" said the king. "Your fate will be the same as those who are here. Therefore, please, do not attempt it. You will make me very unhappy. I take these things to heart so very much." John kissed the good old king's hand and said he was sure it would be all right, for he was quite enchanted with the beautiful princess. Then the princess herself came riding into the palace yard with all her ladies, and he wished her good morning. She looked wonderfully fair and lovely when she offered her hand to John, and he loved her more than ever. How could she be a wicked witch, as all the people asserted? He accompanied her into the hall, and then, when the judges and the whole of the counselors would be present, to try if he could guess the first riddle. If he succeeded, he would have to come a second time, but if not, he would lose his life. And no one had ever been able to guess even one. However, John was not at all anxious about the result of the trial. On the contrary, he was very merry. He thought only of the beautiful princess, and believed that in some way he should have helped, but how he knew not. He longed for the next day so much that he might go to the palace and try his luck at guessing the riddles, but his comrade shook his head and looked very mournful. "I do so wish you to do well," said he. "We might have continued longer together, and now I'm unlikely to lose you, you poor, dear John. I could shed tears, but I will not make you unhappy on the last night we may be together. We will be merry, really merry this evening, and tomorrow, after you are gone, shall we be able to weep undisturbed." It was very quickly known among the inhabitants of the town that another suitor had arrived for the princess, and there was great sorrow in consequence. The theater remained closed. The women who sold sweetmeats tried crepe around the sugar sticks, and the king and the priests were on their knees in the church. There was great lamentation, for no one expected John to succeed better than those who had been suitors before. In the evening, John's comrade prepared a large bowl of punch and said, "Now let us be merry, and drink to the health of the princess." But after drinking 2 glasses, John became so sleepy that he could not keep his eyes open and fell fast asleep. Then his fellow traveler lifted him gently out of his chair and laid him on his back on his bed, and as soon as it was quite dark, he took 2 large wings that he had cut from the dead swan and tied them firmly to his own shoulders. Then he put into his pocket the largest of the 3 wads which he had obtained from the old woman who had fallen and broken her leg. And after this he opened the window and flew away over the town, straight towards the palace, and seated himself in a corner under the window which looked into the bedroom of the princess. All right, kiddo. It's been about 30 minutes. We're going to stop here, and we'll pick this up and finish this story tomorrow so that you can get some rest now. I really hope you have a good rest. I really hope you get lots of sleep, and that you wake up ready to go in the morning so you have a great day. You take care of yourself and you be safe. You hear me?